For tens of thousands of years, people everywhere lived in a rhythm that rarely changed. Follow the herds, pick the berries, can't move on repeat. But here, in this watery cradle, the rules began to shift. The rivers flooded every spring, like giant careless gardeners, tossing down rich black soil. When the waters retreated, the ground gleamed dark and fertile. Barley seeds dropped almost carelessly sprouted tall and golden. Families discovered that if they stayed put, the earth would reward them with more food than they could carry. No more endless wandering, no more chasing game across wind-scoured plains. Here the rivers provided if you could learn to tame them. But taming water was no gentle thing. Some years the floods failed and the land cracked into a mosaic of brittle plates under the sun. Other years, the rivers swelled too high, sweeping away huts, fields, and the hopes of entire seasons in a single night. For these early settlers, water was both master and servant. Too little, and you starved. Too much, and you drowned. So they dug ditches, cut channels, built low embankments with their bare hands. Over generations, they began to shape the rivers themselves. Imagine the quiet pride in realizing you could guide the floods instead of being destroyed by them. That realization that humans could take nature's chaos and bend it was the first brick in the foundation of civilization. Villages began as simple clusters of mud brick houses perched on higher ground to escape the floods. Each had a small shrine at its heart, a reminder that survival wasn't just about clever irrigation. It depended on keeping the gods happy. Offerings of grain fish, or even the sweet date wine, were placed in little altars as if to say, "Please let the floods be kind this year." But one settlement, Eridu, was different. Around 5400 BCE, it rose on a slight hill overlooking the marshes. The people there built a modest shrine to Enki, the god of fresh water. That may not sound like much, but unlike the little family altars in nearby villages, this shrine belonged to everyone. It was a community's sacred space. Each generation rebuilt it larger and grander, stacking mud brick upon mud brick until the shrine itself became a sort of artificial mountain rising from the flat delta. If you squint, you can almost see its whitewashed walls, catching the sunlight a beacon over the reed seas. The villagers didn't know it, but they had just invented the concept of a city. Picture the scene dawn, breaking the marshes, steaming in the golden light. Farmers trudging in baskets of barley, balanced on their backs, heading for the temple granaries. Priests in long robes, weighing offerings on gleaming bronze scales, scratching records onto clay tablets with reed pens. No poetry, yet just careful marks noting who brought what, how much grain was stored, how many goats had been traded. These were the first written words in history, born not from a love of literature, but from the stubborn need to balance accounts. Civilization. It turns out, started with paperwork. Still, for all its practicality, there was magic here. Imagine approaching Eridu from the horizon, the flat marsh suddenly broken by a gleaming white shrine, smoke rising from hearths, the hum of voices speaking not just of survival, but of trade, of law, of ritual. People had begun to live in numbers large enough that you could walk through streets without knowing every face. That was a radical change. No longer just bands of kin, but strangers working together, bound by something new, belief in a shared God, a shared economy, and a shared future. The marshes themselves seemed to echo this transformation. In spring, the waters spread like an inland sea, shimmering as if the earth itself reflected the heavens. In summer, heat baked the ground so hard it cracked like broken pottery. In autumn, the date palms bent heavy with fruit, their shadows stretching across the mud brick houses. And in winter, when the rains came, the land softened again, renewing the cycle. To live here was to live at the mercy of the seasons, yet also to stand at the edge of something new, an age when people could look at the floodplain and say, "We can make this ours." What began in mud and reeds would over centuries turn into the first great cities, the first epic stories, and the first whispers of empire. But for now, in the flickering firelight of Eridu's shrine, it was enough that humans had stopped wandering. They had learned to plant their feet in the soil and raise their eyes to the gods. They had found home. The name sounds simple, almost like a whisper across water. Eridu. To later generations, it was no ordinary settlement. It was the first city, not just in Mesopotamia, but as far as we know in the world. And yet its beginnings were as modest as a reed mat drying in the sun. A few farmers, a shrine of mud brick, a place to store offerings to a local god. From this, the spark of urban life ignited. Let's wander into that early Eridu for a moment. Picture a cluster of rectangular houses, each one shaped from clay, mixed with straw, and baked hard under the relentless sun. Their walls are not much taller than a person's height, but they stand stubbornly resisting flood and wind. Smoke curls lazily from clay ovens where flatbreads crisp. Goats bleat tethered in small courtyards. Fishermen haul in their catches from the marsh channels, their baskets dripping with silver scales. It feels homely, almost ordinary, doesn't it? And yet look toward the center, there rising above the rooftops, is something extraordinary. At first, the shrine to Enki was small, a simple rectangular room with thick mud walls, one doorway facing east to greet the rising sun. Inside, nothing more elaborate than a low altar where villagers left bowls of grain or jars of oil. But what made it special was that it belonged to everyone. Not a family's private altar tucked into a corner, but a community's sacred house. And that changed everything. Generations came and went. Floods tore down the shrine, but each time the people rebuilt it stronger, larger, more ambitious. 1 century, the walls were painted white, gleaming like bone against the marsh. Another century, the priests raised the shrine on a platform of earth, lifting it higher above the flood line. By 4500 BCE, layer upon layer of rebuilding had transformed the once humble temple into a towering ziggurat-like structure, an artificial mountain in a land otherwise flat as a reed mat. From miles away, travelers could spot its bright walls shimmering like a beacon over the horizon. Why did people keep returning to the same spot instead of wandering off to start new villages? The practical answer is geography. Eridu sat where river channels, marsh paths, and dry overland routes converged. It was like the ancient equivalent of a highway interchange. Fishers, farmers, and traders all found themselves passing through. But there was something more magnetic than convenience. The temple in the heart of Eridu didn't just offer grain storage or fair trade. It promised the presence of Enki himself, the god of wisdom and fresh water. And in a land where every sip of water meant life or death, Enki was no small ally. His shrine became not just a house of worship, but the beating heart of society. Farmers brought their surplus grain there. Merchants traded under its protection. Priests weighed transactions on bronze scales, their reed styluses scratching into wet clay marks that would dry and harden into the first written records. The world's earliest words were not songs or stories, but inventories, 10 jars of barley, 2 goats a measure of oil. Imagine the priests hunched over their clay tablets, never suspecting that their neat wedge-shaped symbols would evolve into the world's first script. Humanity's earliest literature began as bookkeeping, and yet that bookkeeping gave Eridu something no earlier settlement had: resilience. When floods ruined a harvest, families could survive on temple-stored grain. When traders brought lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, or obsidian from Anatolia, the priests judged fair prices. When quarrels broke out over land boundaries or water rights, the temple court settled them. The shrine became granary treasury courthouse and market all rolled into one. It was both the lungs and the heartbeat of the city. Step out from the temple and wander the streets, and you'd see how society itself began to change. Closest to the temple lived the wealthiest families, their homes larger and more elaborate, built around cool courtyards decorated with painted murals. Within, artisans shaped jewelry of gold and carnelian or hammered copper into tools that gleamed in the light. Farther out stretched neighborhoods of potters, weavers, and fishermen, more cramped walls, thinner rooms, smaller. The contrast was stark. For the first time in history, inequality wasn't just a matter of chance or bad luck. It was baked into the very layout of the city. Even in death, the differences showed. Elites were buried with carved ivory weapons and exotic stones. Common folk lay to rest with plain pottery and simple copper tools. No doubt, each generation looked at these arrangements and thought them natural, but to their wandering ancestors, it would have been unthinkable. Once survival meant everyone sharing equally in the hunt's success. Now, in Eridu, wealth pooled in the hands of priests and merchants. Civilization was many things, but it was never fair. And yet fairness was not the point. Eridu was a grand experiment in cooperation, and for centuries it worked. By around 4000 BCE, the city may have housed as many as 15,000 people. Think about that, a number so immense that no one person could possibly know every name or face. For a child born in Eridu, life meant waking to the sound of merchants shouting prices in the marketplace, priests chanting hymns at dawn, neighbors firing pots in smoky kilns, fish sizzling in clay ovens. The bustle of permanent streets, recognizable houses, and specialized trades must have felt utterly normal to them, even though it was a revolution in human existence. Eridu's success sent ripples across the marshlands. Other villages looked on and thought, we want that too. Soon, Uruk-Ur, Lagash, and Kish began rising, each with its own patron deity, each trying to outshine its rivals. But Eridu remained the prototype, the mother city. Later, Sumerians would even whisper that kingship itself descended from heaven to Eridu first, as if the gods had chosen this little hilltop shrine to be civilization's cradle. Standing there in the flickering torchlight, you might have sensed that something world-changing had begun. The marshland wind carried the smell of clay smoke and roasting barley. In the distance, the temple walls glowed faintly under the moonlight, a silent promise that humans had found a new way to live, not as wandering bands chasing herds, but as citizens bound together by shared gods, shared laws, and shared ambitions. The age of the city had arrived, and it bore a simple, haunting name, Eridu. Imagine looking down from above, as if you were a bird drifting over the endless marshes of southern Mesopotamia around 3800 BCE. The land below glitters with water channels dotted here and there, with clusters of mud brick homes perched on slightly higher ground. But what you see is not just villages anymore. The clusters are spreading, growing, thickening. The landscape is being transformed before your very eyes, and the small villages are swelling into cities. Eridu had shown the way like the first stone thrown into a still pond. The ripples of its success radiated outward. Soon, new centers were rising. With its crescent-shaped harbor near the Persian Gulf. Uruk, further north, destined to become a roaring metropolis. And Lagash, Kish, each staking a claim to power. In every one, you would notice the same pattern, a sacred complex in the center, surrounded by concentric ripples of houses, workshops, and finally fields stretching out toward the horizon. The village was becoming something much larger, more permanent, and far more complicated. Step into one of these growing cities, and the first thing you'd notice is noise. The slap of clay on molds as workers shaped bricks. The hum of women spinning wool into thread their spindles whirring. Donkeys braying, children laughing and shouting as they ran down narrow streets. The air smelled of smoked barley bread and fresh-cut reeds drying for construction. But beneath the clamor was a new order, a social order taking shape like wet clay pressed into a mold. Priests no longer tended just to rituals. They had become administrators, accountants, record keepers. In their temples, scribes scratched away with styluses on wet clay tablets, tallying rations of beer for workers, or recording the number of sheep sent for sacrifice. To keep the gods fed was important, yes, but keeping the books balanced was sacred work too. Here, writing became the invisible scaffolding holding the city together. Villages could get by on memory and trust. Cities could not. When you're feeding tens of thousands, trust needs to be backed by clay tablets. And trust wasn't the only thing that had to change. With growth came specialization. Farmers no longer tried to make everything themselves. One family grew barley, another raised goats. One man worked leather into sandals, another hammered copper into plow blades. Down narrow alleys, potters hunched over wheels that spun with hypnotic rhythm, producing jars and bowls by the hundreds. Specialization meant efficiency, but it also meant dependence. You couldn't live without the shoemaker, or the brewer, or the potter anymore. Civilization was a team sport, whether you liked it or not. And what a team it was. The fishermen pulling in net after net from the rivers. The herdsmen leading long lines of goats through city gates at dawn. The brewers boiling up great vats of barley mash to make beer. The daily wage of workers sloshed into clay mugs and swallowed with satisfaction. Beer was safer than water, easier to store than grain, and tastier than both. You might say, with only slight exaggeration, that beer built the cities. As the city expanded, inequality deepened. The wealthiest families clustered near the temple, their courtyards wide their walls, painted with images of feasts, gods, and flowing rivers. They could afford imported obsidian knives, golden jewelry, and exotic shells carved into delicate ornaments. Meanwhile, ordinary laborers lived in tight-packed neighborhoods, their houses small and dark walls, pressed so close together that a child could leap from one roof to another. Their possessions were simple clay pots, reed mats, a few tools. And yet even this was wealth compared to their nomadic ancestors. To own a permanent home, to have storage jars filled with grain, to send children to fetch water from the same well every day, that was security unknown to most of human history. But let's not romanticize it too much. The city could be a harsh place. Diseases spread quickly in cramped quarters. Rats and insects found endless food scraps to thrive on. Floods could still sweep away outer districts, and when the irrigation canals clogged with silt crops failed and hunger pressed close. To live in a city was to gamble that the benefits outweighed the risks. Still, the gamble seemed worth it. The population grew not only because of higher birth rates, but because migrants poured in from the countryside. For a young family in a village, the lure was irresistible. In the city, you could find work as a craftsman, sell goods in the market, maybe even rise in fortune if the gods smiled and the temple needed more clerks. Over time, the cities became magnets, pulling in people and resources until southern Mesopotamia glittered with urban lights like stars on the dark marsh plain. And at the heart of it all was the temple. Temples were no longer modest shrines. They were sprawling complexes with storerooms, courtyards, workshops, and offices. They were banks, warehouses, schools, and spiritual centers rolled into one. priests became power brokers. If you controlled the temple, you controlled the city's food, its wealth, its gods, and often enough its laws. But there was competition. Uruk in particular began to outshine Eridu. By around 3500 BCE, Uruk had grown to a staggering 50,000 people, its great ziggurat to the goddess Inanna, rising like a staircase to heaven. Imagine pilgrims trudging from far-off villages gasping at the sight of its gleaming white walls, its monumental staircases. To them, it must have looked like something halfway between human and divine proof that mortals could build as the gods built. The shift from villages to cities was not just physical, it was psychological. For the first time, people began to think of themselves not just as members of a family or a clan, but as citizens of a city. You were from Uruk, or from Ur, or from Lagash, and that identity carried pride, obligations, and rivalries. Wars would be fought over which city deserved supremacy. Legends would be told of their founding kings. The Sumerians were inventing not just urban life, but civic life. Imagine being a child born into one of these early cities. Your parents would tell you stories of ancestors who wandered with tents and flocks. You'd nod politely, but in your heart, you couldn't imagine it. For you, life was streets, neighbors, schools, and markets. The city was your world, and it was expanding fast. The transformation was so complete that within just a few centuries, the marshland wanderers of old had become almost myth themselves. Their lives, once the human norm, were already fading into legend. The Sumerians had crossed a threshold. The world of villages was behind them. Ahead lay ziggurats, dynasties, wars, and empires. But it all began here, in the moment when scattered huts grew together and villages became cities. If Eridu was the first spark, then Uruk was the bonfire. By the 4th millennium BCE, the marshlands of Sumer were glowing with settlements, but Uruk blazed brighter than them all. To later ages, its name would ring with myth, home of Gilgamesh, cradle of writing stage for monumental architecture. But in its own day, it was simply overwhelming. Imagine walking toward it across the flat Mesopotamian plain from miles away. You'd see its gleaming walls and towering temple platforms. For people used to reed huts and low mud brick houses, it must have felt like approaching another world. Uruk's population swelled to perhaps 50,000, a number unthinkable only centuries earlier. To put that in perspective, most villages, even in fertile regions, rarely topped a few hundred souls. Uruk was no village. It was a sprawling organism of humanity, 6 square kilometers of houses, temples, workshops, and bustling streets. This was the Uruk explosion, the first time in history when urban life scaled up so dramatically that it transformed everything: economy, politics, religion, even how people thought about themselves. At the city's heart rose the great precincts of the gods. One was dedicated to Anu, the Sky Father, his ziggurat thrusting upward like a stairway to the heavens. Another honored Inanna, goddess of love and war, whose temple complex throbbed with offerings, rituals, and festivals. Pilgrims came from miles around to see the dazzling whitewashed walls and to leave gifts of grain beer and livestock. And surrounding the sacred centers was the living city lanes, choked with donkey caravans, merchants shouting out prices, children weaving through crowds, artisans at work in their smoky courtyards. Uruk was not just big, it was innovative. Around this time, potters began using the potter's wheel, an unassuming invention that multiplied production 100-fold. Instead of uneven hand-shaped jars, they could now produce rows of nearly identical vessels, perfect for storing grain, beer, or oil. The same principle of rotation that spun clay into shape would in time spin wheels on carts, revolutionizing transport. Imagine a craftsman's quiet grin the first time he realized his spinning wheel could move not just clay, but entire loads of goods. Bronze, too, was entering the picture, copper hardened with tin, producing sharper plow blades, sturdier tools, and deadlier weapons. Fields could be worked more efficiently, harvests stored in greater abundance, but so could armies be armed with new axes and spears. Civilization was advancing in tandem with its capacity for both prosperity and violence. And then there was writing. Not literature, yet not epics, not hymns, those would come later. But here in Uruk, scribes took the clay tokens and tally marks of earlier centuries and streamlined them into wedge-shaped impressions pressed into tablets. Cuneiform, we call it now. At first, it was purely practical lists of sheep jars of oil, amounts of silver. But even in these dry accounts, you can hear civilization's pulse quickening. Once people could store knowledge outside their own heads, the city could grow without forgetting itself. Written records let the economy scale up. Bureaucracy expand law, become consistent. It was like upgrading from human memory to a clay hard drive. Education followed. The Aduba scribal schools sprang up where young boys from wealthy families hunched over clay tablets, copying signs again and again until their hands cramped. Their teachers no doubt sighed with the same exasperation as modern schoolmasters. And the boys no doubt daydreamed as much as modern students. Still, this rote training seeded the first intellectual class in history, people who could preserve knowledge, transmit it, and innovate on top of it. But Uruk's influence didn't stop at its walls. Traders carried its goods, its weights, and measures its artistic motifs across Mesopotamia and beyond. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedar wood from Lebanon, copper from Oman, all flowed into Uruk's workshops. In return, Uruk's merchants spread cuneiform cylinder seals and architectural styles as far as Anatolia and Iran. For the first time, humanity was flirting with globalization. Step back a moment and think in a world where most people still lived in small farming hamlets. Uruk's citizens were already strolling paved courtyards, attending festivals with hundreds of participants, or negotiating contracts under temple supervision. The sheer scale must have redefined what it meant to be human. You weren't just a farmer, or a potter, or a herdsman. You were a citizen of Uruk, part of something larger, a machine of tens of thousands, all humming together. Of course, such humming was never entirely harmonious. Inequality deepened. The rich built spacious compounds near the temples, their walls painted, their floors paved. The poor squeezed into cramped alleys, their walls rough, their roofs patched with whatever reeds could be found. And yet even the poor gained from the city's wealth steady access to food markets for their wares' protection within strong walls. For all its flaws, Uruk was magnetic. People kept coming. Festivals must have been extraordinary. Imagine the procession of Inanna's statue borne through the streets on gilded poles, priests chanting, musicians playing lyres and drums, incense thick in the air. Crowds pressed forward to catch a glimpse, to offer prayers, to feel connected to something cosmic. Religion was not a private affair. It was woven into the city's very heartbeat. By the end of the Uruk period, around 3100 BCE, the model was set a monumental center of temples, surrounded by neighborhoods, stratified by wealth and occupation, all tied together by bureaucracy, writing, and trade. Other cities would copy the pattern, but Uruk had done it first, and at a scale no one had imagined. Even in later centuries, when Ur and Lagash rose to prominence, Uruk held a special place in memory. To Sumerians, it was not just a city, but the prototype of urban life. Its king Gilgamesh would become the first great hero of world literature, his struggles echoing across millennia. But in these early days, before legend took over, Uruk was simply a marvel of human cooperation, tens of thousands working together, guided by temples, bound by tablets, and fueled perhaps by an awful lot of beer. It was here, in the heat and dust of Uruk, that humanity's great experiment with large-scale civilization truly exploded into being. The ripples of that explosion are still with us every time you walk through a city street, read a written word, or count in base 60. Without realizing it, you're touching the legacy of Uruk. Let's pause in the crowded streets of Uruk and follow the sound of styluses scratching clay. If there's one invention that defines the Sumerians, it's writing. Not because it was glamorous, at first it wasn't, but because it let their world expand beyond the fragile limits of memory. Picture a priest's assistant in a dusty courtyard, kneeling over a fresh lump of wet clay. He presses a sharpened reed into its surface, one mark, then another, then a cluster of neat little impressions. His brow furrows. Too many sheep delivered this morning, and the temple granaries need accurate counts. He wipes sweat from his forehead, mutters a prayer to Inanna, and carefully places the tablet in the sun to dry. That's it. No poetry, no hymns, no stirring speeches, just sheep. But that simple act is the beginning of cuneiform, the world's first writing system. Before this, people had tried to keep track with clay tokens, tiny spheres, cones, or discs, each representing goods. A cone might mean one measure of grain, a sphere, one goat, and so on. Tokens worked fine in a small village. But in Uruk, with caravans arriving daily and warehouses filled to the brim, tokens became chaos. Someone had the bright idea to press the token's shape directly into clay, and soon enough, styluses replaced the tokens altogether. Suddenly, the city could keep detailed accounts: which farmer delivered how much, which merchant owed what, how many jars of beer went to the workers building a temple wall. At first, writing was purely utilitarian. It was about rations, debts, inventories. But hidden inside those marks was the seed of something far greater, the idea that language could be captured and preserved outside the human mind. No longer did knowledge vanish when the storyteller died. No longer did memory fade like footprints in the sand. On these small clay tablets, information could live forever, or at least as long as the tablet didn't get smashed. And what a script it was. Those wedge-shaped impressions, cuneiform, as we now call them, looked deceptively simple, but the scribes of Uruk turned them into a versatile system, capable of representing objects, numbers, even ideas. One sign could mean barley, another could mean to give. Combine them, and suddenly you had a sentence: barley given. It wasn't long before verbs, subjects, and abstract notions joined the mix. By 3200, BCE clay tablets could record not just transactions, but laws, proverbs, even stories. This leap gave rise to an entirely new profession, the scribe. And make no mistake, scribes were elite. Becoming one wasn't easy. You started as a boy. Sorry girls were generally excluded, sent to the Adaba, the tablet house. Day after day, you copied the same signs over and over until your stylus hand cramped and your teacher barked at you to keep going. The clay dust clung to your hair and clothes. Your ears rang with the constant scratch of reeds. It wasn't glamorous, but it was powerful. If you could write, you could serve the temple, the palace, the courts. You became a gatekeeper of knowledge. The Aduba was the world's first formal school. It produced not just accountants, but thinkers. Students learned math, how to measure fields, calculate rations, divide harvests. They learned to record legal judgments, contracts, and treaties. They copied myths and hymns, committing them to clay so they could be passed on for generations. In this way, the Sumerians invented not only writing, but education. They created a system to preserve and transmit culture deliberately, instead of leaving it to the unreliable whisper chain of oral tradition. Let's slip into one of those classrooms for a moment. Imagine the master stern and tired, pacing with a reed rod in hand, while a boy kneels over a clay tablet, tongue sticking out in concentration. He carves the sign for ox too shallow. Smack a tap of the rod. He starts again. Hours later, the courtyard is littered with discarded tablets, clay mistakes that will be kneaded back into lumps for tomorrow's lessons. The students grumble, but they're also shaping the future. Without them, no literature, no law, no recorded history, just silence. It's tempting to think that the first literature must have appeared instantly, but it took centuries. The earliest texts we've recovered are mostly dull lists of barley tallies, of sheep records of wages. Yet within that monotony lay the tools for grandeur. By around 2500, BCE scribes were composing hymns to the gods, recording proverbs, and setting down the first myths. Stories that had once lived only in the smoky glow of a storyteller's fire could now outlast both fire and storyteller. Writing also transformed law. When disputes arose, judgments could be recorded, reference standardized. Justice was no longer entirely at the mercy of a judge's memory or mood. Clay tablets gave law a kind of permanence, a sense that fairness could be fixed in place like the marks themselves. And then there's mathematics. The Sumerians loved numbers. They developed the sexagesimal system, the base 60 math that still gives us 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. To them, numbers weren't just tools for farming or trade. They were sacred, reflecting cosmic order. Imagine scribes scratching multiplication tables into clay while the sun burned overhead, unaware that thousands of years later, astronauts would still be using their system to calculate rocket trajectories. Not bad for a bunch of clay tablets. What's remarkable is how quickly cuneiform spread. From Uruk, it traveled outward like ripples in water. Traders carried tablets and styluses to Anatolia, Iran, even as far as Egypt. Other cultures borrowed the idea, adapted it, reshaped it. Writing became a contagion, not of disease, but of possibility. Think of it this way. Before writing, knowledge was fragile, tethered to human memory. One forgotten word, one failed storyteller, and a piece of wisdom vanished forever. With writing, knowledge became durable. Ideas could leap across, time survive droughts, floods, and wars. They could outlive their authors. They could reach us. And so, while Uruk's walls gleamed in the sun and its temples rang with chants, perhaps its greatest monument was not stone or brick, but clay, thousands upon thousands of little clay tablets stacked in storerooms, buried in archives, waiting for millennia until archaeologists brushed them free of dust. In those wedge-shaped marks, we hear the voices of the first accountants, the first teachers, the first poets, voices that still murmur across 5,000 years. The invention of writing wasn't a sudden thunderclap. It was a slow drip of reeds into clay, an accumulation of necessity that turned into genius. But once the floodgates opened, humanity could never return to silence. From the marshes of Sumer flowed not just rivers of water, but rivers of words, and those rivers still flow through us today. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a city at dusk. The air smells of roasting fish and damp clay. From the temple courtyard, drums begin to beat. Torches flare, shadows stretch long, and priests in embroidered robes chant hymns into the rising night. If you lived in Sumer around 3000 BCE, this wasn't background noise, it was the heartbeat of your universe. For the Sumerians, the world was never silent or empty. It was alive with divine personalities, each one with moods, grudges, and appetites. The sky, the rivers, the winds. These weren't natural forces. They were gods, And the gods weren't far away, lounging in some inaccessible heaven. They were here in the canals, the fields, the storms that either watered your barley or flattened it. At the top of their celestial family tree sat in the Skyfather, distant, serene, more of a cosmic landlord than an active manager. If An was the absentee owner, Enlil, Lord of Wind and Storm, was the one running the day-to-day operations. Enlil could bring rain or drought victory, or ruin depending on his temper. In Enki, the god of fresh water and wisdom, people saw the trickster engineer, a deity with mud under his fingernails, appropriate for a culture that built everything out of clay. And then there was Inanna, goddess of love and war, whose dual nature made her both irresistible and terrifying. She might bless your fields with fertility or unleash chaos with the same passion. The Sumerian pantheon wasn't tidy. It was more like an extended family dinner, with everyone arguing across the table, forming alliances, and stabbing each other in the back, sometimes literally. But this chaos reflected the messy reality of life in the floodplains. The gods weren't perfect. They were powerful, unpredictable, and sometimes cruel. Which, if you think about it, sounds an awful lot like the weather. Religious life centered on maintaining cosmic order, what the Sumerians called me a word that meant both divine ordinances and the building blocks of civilization. The me included things like kingship wisdom, weaving justice music, even lying had its own divine ordinance. To the Sumerians, every part of human life, from grinding flour to conducting rituals, was woven into the cosmic fabric. If the gods granted the me, civilization thrived. If they withdrew, chaos returned. This wasn't abstract philosophy. You could see it in the temple rituals that punctuated daily life. Each morning, priests washed and dressed the statues of the gods as if they were royal guests, offering food, drink, and incense. It wasn't symbolic. The gods were thought to actually consume the essence of the offerings, while the priests enjoyed the leftovers. Imagine being a priest's apprentice, carefully setting down a steaming bowl of stew in front of a gleaming statue, whispering prayers, while secretly hoping your portion afterward had enough meat in it. Festivals brought the whole community into the divine drama. Inanna's processions were legendary. Her golden statue carried through Uruk's streets on poles, followed by dancers, musicians, and throngs of worshippers. The air filled with the scent of burning incense, the pounding of drums, the cries of people hoping to catch her eye. For a moment, the boundary between human and divine blurred. These myths and rituals weren't just entertaining, they were explanations. Why did the rivers flood unpredictably? Because Enki and Enlil were quarreling again. Why did crops wither? Perhaps Inanna had turned her gaze elsewhere. The gods' moods mapped onto the seasons, the weather, even human behavior. Myth was not escape from reality. It was the user's manual for surviving it, and in these myths, humans didn't play starring roles. The Sumerians believed mortals were created to serve the gods, to grow their food, build their temples, and keep the cosmic machine humming. Not the most glamorous job description, perhaps, but it gave life structure. To farm barley, to bake bread, to pour beer at the temple, these were sacred acts sustaining not just people, but the universe itself. Consider their creation stories. In one version, the gods, tired of digging canals and farming, fashioned humans from clay, mixed with the blood of a slain deity. The message was clear. You were literally shaped from the mud of the floodplain to do the work the gods didn't want to. Next time you complain about chores, imagine being told yes, but your entire species was invented for that exact purpose. Hard to argue. Yet even within this hierarchy, there was room for human dignity. Myths often explored the tension between divine will and mortal cleverness. Enki the trickster sometimes bent rules to save humanity, warning a chosen man of an impending flood, or sneaking the me of civilization to humankind. The gods might be powerful, but humans could be resourceful. Civilization itself, in a way, was the result of this cosmic tug-of-war. As cities grew, theology evolved with them. Local agricultural deities, gods of grain rivers or livestock expanded into grander figures of justice, wisdom, and kingship. The division of labor in society was mirrored in heaven. There was a divine specialist for nearly every human profession. Just as a potter or brewer had their role in the city, so too did the gods of brewing or smithing in the cosmos. Heaven was a bureaucracy, and earth was its office branch. The Sumerian worldview was not comforting in the way later religions tried to be. There was no clear promise of paradise after death, no guarantee of eternal reward. The afterlife, such as it was imagined as a shadowy underworld where all souls went rich or poor, saint or sinner. What mattered wasn't escaping mortality, it was maintaining order here and now. Civilization survived only so long as humans performed their duties, and the gods received their offerings. And so, night after night, priests sang hymns, sacrifices smoked on altars, and worshippers bowed their heads trying to align themselves with cosmic law. To be Sumerian was to live with a constant awareness that the world was fragile, perched between chaos and order, and that your daily work, watering the fields, mending a roof, offering a prayer, was part of keeping that balance intact. It may sound grim, but there was a kind of beauty in it. Imagine standing at dawn in Uruk, the ziggurat glowing in the first light, temple bells, ringing the smell of bread wafting from ovens. To the people who lived there, this wasn't just another morning. It was proof that the gods were still with them, that order still held, that civilization still stood. And for them, that was meaning enough. If Uruk dazzled the ancient world with its temples and walls, its most enduring treasure wasn't baked brick or barley, it was a story. A story of a king so powerful that his shadow still stretches over 5,000 years. His name, Gilgamesh. Half man, half god, full of contradictions. To us, he is a mythic hero. To the people of Uruk, he may have been a very real king, around 2700 BCE, remembered so vividly that memory blurred into legend. Let's imagine him for a moment, not the polished statue or the epic hero, but the man. A towering figure striding through Uruk's crowded streets, hair wild from the wind shoulders, draped in lion skins. He's restless, ambitious, and frankly, a bit of a menace. Early tales describe him as overbearing, taking whatever or whomever he pleased. The people prayed for relief from their own king. And when a population begs the gods to rein in their ruler, you know leadership reviews are not going well. The gods answered by creating Enkidu, a wild man of the steppe covered in hair, running with gazelles drinking from rivers alongside beasts. If Gilgamesh embodied civilization at its most domineering, Enkidu was nature untamed. Their clash was inevitable. Picture Uruk's streets holding their breath as the two wrestled dust-rising crowds shouting. Neither won, not exactly. Instead, something better happened. They became friends. The tyrant and the wild man bound together in a friendship so deep it became the heart of the world's first great epic. From there, the stories tumble out like wine from a jar. Gilgamesh and Enkidu set off on adventures that sound part superhero movie, part therapy session. They slay Humbaba, the monstrous guardian of the cedar forest, a figure both terrifying and pitiful. They defeat the bull of heaven, sent by an offended Inanna after Gilgamesh rejected her advances, because apparently even goddesses don't take rejection well. Each victory is glorious, but also costly. For every triumph, another shadow falls. And then comes the breaking point in Kidu's death. However the storytellers spun it, whether as divine punishment for killing the bull of heaven, or simply the cruel twist of fate, the result is the same. Gilgamesh's roaring laughter collapses into grief. Imagine him sitting on the ground beside his friend's body, dust clinging to his face, refusing food, weeping until the earth itself seemed to mourn with him. For the first time, the great king tasted the bitterness of mortality. From that grief comes the heart of the epic, the quest for immortality. Gilgamesh sets out beyond the edge of the world, through mountains of darkness and seas of death, chasing the secret of eternal life. He finds Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, a Mesopotamian Noah, who once built an ark to save humanity when the gods tried to drown it all away. Utnapishtim has been granted immortality, but tells Gilgamesh bluntly, "The life you seek, you will not find." It's the ancient world's way of saying, "Sorry, kid, that's above your pay grade." Still, Gilgamesh refuses to give up. He dives into the deep and retrieves the plant of youth, only to lose it to a snake while bathing. It's a cruel little twist, isn't it? A serpent slithers in, eats the plant, sheds its skin, and slinks away renewed. Meanwhile, the great king is left with empty hands. It's hard not to feel that the storytellers were winking at us. Immortality belongs to snakes and stories, not kings. So Gilgamesh trudges back to Uruk, defeated in his quest, but transformed in spirit. He climbs the city walls and looks out over the massive bricks, the shining temples, the bustling streets. And he realizes this is his legacy. Not eternal life in his own flesh, but the city he built, the people he ruled, the stories told about him. Mortality is inevitable, but meaning can be made. That's the genius of the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's not just about a king, it's about us. It asks the same questions we still ask when the lights are out and the world grows quiet. Why do we die? What makes life worth living if it ends? Can friendship, love, or creation outlast the grave? And the answers are neither simple nor falsely comforting. The Sumerians didn't promise paradise. They promised work, love, loss, and the chance to leave something behind. Think of the context. This was the world's first epic poem, composed centuries before Homer sang of Achilles or Odysseus. Written on clay tablets, copied and recopied for millennia, it survived floods, fires, and the fall of empires. Even when the Sumerian language itself died out, Gilgamesh lived on, translated into Akkadian, Hittite, Babylonian. When archaeologists dug up those tablets in the 19th century and began piecing the story together, it was like a voice whispering across 4,000 years. I was here. I lived. I loved. I feared death too. And that whisper still reaches us. Every time someone reads Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk gets another moment of immortality. Not the kind he set out to find, but perhaps the only kind that truly exists. Imagine yourself drifting off to sleep now, hearing the footsteps of Gilgamesh echo across Uruk's streets. A flawed king, a grieving friend, a seeker of eternal life who found instead the wisdom to live fully in the time allotted. His story was their mirror, their therapy, their myth, and ours too. Because in the end, every city crumbles, every king dies, every plant of youth slips away. But friendship, love, and stories, those endure. And in that, Gilgamesh found his answer. Walk into a Sumerian city, and the first thing your eyes would be drawn to is the temple. Always the temple. Rising above the cluster of houses perched on its platform of sun-baked brick, painted white so it glowed in the desert sun. The temple was not just a place of worship, it was the spine of the city, the beating heart, and sometimes the very stomach-swallowing offerings and redistributing them as rations. But as centuries passed, the temple no longer stood alone. A new neighbor appeared across the street, so to speak, the palace. And with that arrival, history changed. In the earliest days, priests ruled the cities. They weren't kings in the sense we picture: no crowns, no armies at their beck and call. They were caretakers, administrators of the gods' estates. They oversaw irrigation, stored grain, settled disputes, and organized rituals. Imagine them as a mix between accountant mayor and part-time meteorologist, trying to keep the city in harmony with both the heavens and the floodwaters. Yet the more the cities grew, the more complicated life became. Trade routes stretched further. Surpluses swelled. Rivalries sharpened. And when disputes with neighboring cities tipped into raids and battles, priests found themselves ill-suited to lead men into the fray. Enter the Lugal, literally big man. At first, these were temporary war leaders chosen in times of crisis. But crisis has a habit of becoming permanent when you're fighting over water rights and fertile land. And soon enough, the Lugal stopped stepping down when the dust settled. He simply kept the title. Now the city had two power centers, the temple and the palace. Picture Uruk or Lagash around 2600 BCE. In the sacred quarter, priests conducted offerings, weighed goods on bronze scales, and scribbled records into clay tablets. In the palace complex, sometimes sprawling with courtyards, gardens, and decorated halls, the king received envoys, commanded soldiers, and issued decrees. Both claimed authority, but of different kinds. The temple drew legitimacy from the gods, the palace from force and charisma. And so, the two began to dance, sometimes partners, sometimes rivals. The temple economy was staggering in scale. Think of it as the ancient world's first corporation. Temples owned fields, orchards, and herds. They ran workshops where men hammered copper and women wove wool into fine cloth. They distributed rations of beer and bread to thousands of laborers. They even kept detailed archives, rows of clay tablets listing who worked, where, who received which portion, who owed what debt. One priest administrator might oversee more livestock than many modern ranchers. Another managed textile production that would make a fashion house blush. All of it belonged to the gods, of course, but in practice, it meant the priests held extraordinary power. And then there was the palace, the world of the Lugal. His legitimacy didn't come from balancing accounts. It came from victories, military success, diplomatic triumphs, massive construction projects. A Lugal might commemorate his reign, not with ledgers, but with steles showing him smiting enemies, or carrying the first basket of clay to build a city wall. These images told the people, I am chosen by the gods. My strength is their strength. My reign is their will. The palace and the temple were not always enemies. Often they worked together. The king needed the priests to bless his campaigns and declare that Enlil or Inanna favored his cause. The priests needed the king to protect temple lands and provide labor for construction. Together, they fused into a system that gave Sumer both stability and tension, two pillars sacred and secular holding up the same roof. And let's not forget the architecture. Temples grew ever more ambitious, their platforms layered higher, their staircases wider, their shrines more dazzling. Ziggurats, those massive stepped pyramids, began as humble shrines rebuilt again and again, like tree rings marking centuries of faith. Each new layer was both practical and symbolic, lifting the people's offerings closer to the gods. From miles away, travelers could see them rising above the plain monuments of mud brick, declaring, "Here dwells the divine." Palaces, meanwhile, grew into miniature cities themselves. Picture courtyards shaded by awnings, storerooms stacked with tribute walls decorated with mosaics of shining shells pressed into plaster. Officials hurried down corridors, carrying clay tablets tucked under their arms. Guards lounged by gateways, spears upright. Musicians strummed lyres in banquet halls, while nobles reclined on cushioned mats drinking beer from tall jars with reed straws. The palace was not only a residence, it was theater. Everything about it broadcast power. The rise of palaces brought new pressures. Armies needed to be fed, equipped, and paid. Fortifications had to be built. Victorious kings rewarded loyal soldiers and officials with land and privileges. Slowly, a class of secular elites rose alongside the priesthood. Sumer was no longer just a land of temples. It was a land of courts and palaces of monarchs, claiming divine sanction to rule not just by prayer, but by decree. And yet, even with palaces growing, grander temples remained central. When a king entered a city, he didn't simply march into his palace. He first processed to the temple, offered sacrifices, and performed rituals affirming his bond with the gods. Rule without religion was unthinkable. The palace needed the temple's blessing, like a body needs a heartbeat. This dual system, the sacred temple and the secular palace, was one of Sumer's great innovations. It set the pattern for millennia of Near Eastern kingdoms. Pharaohs in Egypt, emperors in Assyria, kings in Babylon, all would balance divine and worldly authority in some form. You might say, the Sumerians wrote the template in mud and reed for how power would look for thousands of years. But let's not forget the human side of all this grandeur. Imagine the scribe shuffling between temple and palace with clay tablets muttering about deadlines. The soldier standing guard in a courtyard eyeing the beer ration cart and wondering if his pay would come on time. The weaver hunched over a loom in a temple workshop, her fingers aching, but her cloth destined to clothe a king. For them, the lofty dance between priest and king wasn't abstract philosophy. It was daily bread, or lack thereof. Still, from the outside, the system worked. The city thrived. The gods were honored, the walls defended, the canals maintained. And above it all, the temples and palaces stood side by side, one reaching upward toward heaven, the other stretching outward across the land. Together, they made the Sumerian city not just a place to live, but a place to believe, to obey, to build, and to dream. The sun rises over the southern plains of Mesopotamia, glinting off canals and temple walls. But peace is deceptive. By around 2900 BCE, the land of Sumer had become a checkerboard of city-states: Uruk-ur-Lagash, Umma, Kish, Nippur, each like a proud little island surrounded by fertile fields. Each one boasted its own patron god, its own temple complex, its own ruler, and increasingly, its own ambitions. This was the early dynastic age, when Sumer thrummed with vitality and tension all at once. Picture the land, not a unified kingdom, but dozens of walled cities scattered like beads on a necklace. From above, you'd see a patchwork ziggurats rising here, smoke curling there, fields divided by irrigation canals glinting like silver veins. And between those canals, rivalry sharper than a bronze spear point. At the beginning, leadership still carried echoes of the old priesthood. The Ensi, or Lord of the Plow, was supposed to govern as steward of the god's land, overseeing irrigation and rituals. In theory, he was less a tyrant than a caretaker, chosen to keep divine and human affairs in harmony. But theory tends to buckle under pressure. Populations grew, harvests strained the canals, and neighboring cities started glaring at one another's fields with hungry eyes. What had begun as priestly stewardship turned slowly but surely into competitive politics. Enter the Lugal, the big man. Originally, a Lugal might emerge in times of crisis, leading citizens in battle and then stepping aside. But as wars became constant, these temporary generals hardened into permanent monarchs. The Lugal built his own palace, commanded loyal soldiers, and claimed that his authority came straight from the gods. The temple might still matter, but the palace was becoming the louder voice. And there was plenty to fight over. Water most of all. In Sumer canals were lifelines. If your upstream neighbor decided to divert more water for his fields, your crops withered. Entire cities might go hungry because someone upriver built a new embankment. It doesn't take much imagination to see how quickly that turned into war. Picture farmers, weary from harvest, drafted into lines of infantry, their plowshares hastily swapped for bronze-tipped spears. The rivalry between Lagash and Umma is a perfect example. Their fields lay side by side, divided by canals and boundary stones. But canals silt up, boundaries blur, and greed does what greed always does. One inscription from Lagash boasts of leaving 3,600 enemy corpses for the vultures. Archaeologists even uncovered the stele of the vultures, a chilling stone carving neat rows of soldiers marching in phalanx, trampling the fallen, while vultures swoop overhead with bits of flesh dangling from their beaks. Nothing sleepy about that image, though it does remind us that civilization and carnage often grow side by side. Yet life in these city-states wasn't just endless battle. It was also innovation. The early dynastic period produced some of the most remarkable advances of Sumerian culture. Law codes began to crystallize, contracts were written in detail, and temples managed economic enterprises like full-fledged corporations. Craftsmen perfected bronze tools, architects refined ziggurat construction, and scribes recorded the names of rulers for the first time in what we call the Sumerian king list. The king list, part history, part myth, part political propaganda. It begins with the claim that kingship itself descended from heaven to Eridu, then passed from city to city like a divine baton. The early entries are fantastical kings, ruling for tens of thousands of years until the Great Flood washed them away. Later entries become more believable, 20 years here, 40 years there. The king list wasn't just a chronicle. It was a way of imposing order on chaos, of pretending that power wasn't seized by spears and scheming, but handed down by divine plan. A bedtime story really, though, the kind whispered by kings to reassure themselves. Day-to-day life under these dynasties would have felt both ordinary and astonishing. Farmers plowed their fields behind oxen, sang work songs, and grumbled about taxes. Women spun wool-brewed beer and managed households, though priestesses sometimes commanded estates that rivaled noblemen's wealth. Children fetched water in clay jars and played with little reed toys. And yet surrounding these daily rhythms was a world bristling with soldiers' palaces and competing gods. To live in Sumer was to belong to a city, and to belong to a city was to be part of a rivalry that could erupt in violence at any moment. Temples and palaces coexisted uneasily. The Ensi might lead religious rituals, but the Lugal led armies. Priests weighed offerings while kings weighed tribute. When a king built a new temple, he made sure his name was carved into the foundation stones. Piety and propaganda went hand in hand. If the harvest was good, it was thanks to the king's devotion. If the canals flowed, it was thanks to his strength. And if your neighbor's city was sacked, clearly the gods had favored you. Despite the constant conflict, culture flourished. Hymns to the gods became more elaborate. Myths of creation floods and heroic deeds circulated in scribal schools. Artists carved intricate cylinder seals that doubled as signatures and works of art. Musicians strummed lyres at banquets, their songs echoing in halls decorated with shell mosaics. Even war itself spurred innovation, better weapons, stronger walls, and new strategies that shaped the very idea of organized combat. By 2600 BCE, Sumer was a land alive with ambition. No single city ruled supreme. Instead, dozens competed, each proclaiming itself the chosen of the gods, each building higher temples, stronger walls, and sharper spears. This patchwork of rival polities was both vibrant and unstable. For a few centuries, it worked a tense balance of trade and conflict rivalry and cooperation. But beneath the surface, pressure was building. Because when too many big men occupy the same small plain, eventually one of them decides he deserves to be the biggest of all. The early dynastic age was the adolescence of civilization. Restless, inventive, quarrelsome, sometimes brilliant, sometimes bloody. It laid the groundwork for what was to come, the first true empires. The first sweeping claims to rule not just a city, but the entire land of Sumer. But for now, the sound of flutes at a festival might be followed by the clash of bronze in the fields. Temples rang with hymns. Palaces rang with boasts. Canals carried water, and sometimes soldiers. It was a world perched between cooperation and chaos, each city glancing sideways at its neighbor's fields, each ruler dreaming of eternal glory. And in the shimmering heat of the Mesopotamian sun, the Sumerians built not only walls and temples, but the stage on which the drama of kingship rivalry and empire would play out for millennia. The land between the rivers looks peaceful. From a distance, shimmering canals, barley fields rippling like gold under the wind, and temple towers gleaming in the sun. But if you listened closely in the early dynastic age, you'd hear something else: the clatter of bronze, the stamp of boots, the shouted cadence of men drilling in formation. Sumer was not only the birthplace of cities, it was the birthplace of organized war. Conflict had always existed, of course. Neolithic villagers probably quarreled over grazing land, raided neighbors for cattle, or defended fishing spots with clubs and stones. But in Sumer war became something new: professional, systematic, and terrifying in scale. Why? Because the stakes had grown higher. A stolen goat was one thing. Control of an irrigation canal feeding thousands of acres, that was worth blood. Let's start with the basics. The Sumerians were among the first to develop true armies. No longer just farmers picking up pitchforks in a crisis. These were trained soldiers, drilled in formations, supplied with standardized weapons. Archaeologists studying burial sites like the Royal Cemetery at Ur found helmets of hammered copper shields, spears, and even early battle carts buried with warriors. This wasn't casual fighting anymore. It was the beginnings of military profession. The typical Sumerian battle line was a phalanx rows of spearmen, packed shoulder-to-shoulder shields, overlapping spear points, bristling outward like a wall of thorns. Discipline was everything. Imagine the dust rising as hundreds of men stomped in unison, shields, thudding, spears rattling. Against a mob of unorganized fighters, the phalanx was unstoppable. For the first time, war was less about individual heroics and more about collective precision. Weapons themselves were evolving. Bronze-tipped spears bit deeper than stone. Axes with curved blades split shields with frightening efficiency. Soldiers wore cloaks of leather or felt for protection, and copper helmets gleamed under the sun. The wealthier cities even fielded war carts, four-wheeled vehicles drawn by donkeys, carrying a driver and a warrior armed with javelins. They weren't nimble like later chariots, but they provided mobile platforms for commanders, a kind of ancient tank that terrified opponents unused to such speed and force. And then there was the infamous stele of the vultures, carved around 2450 BCE by Eannatum of Lagash to celebrate victory over neighboring Umma. On one side, you see the new face of warfare: tight ranks of armored soldiers marching in phalanx, trampling the bodies of their enemies. On the other, a gruesome scene: vultures swooping down to pick at the corpses left in their wake. The message was clear: victory meant annihilation. War was no longer ritual combat between champions. It was industrial slaughter, measured in body counts carved into stone. The texts are just as chilling. One inscription boasts that Lagash left 3,600 enemy corpses on the battlefield. Another describes captured soldiers bound in nets and presented to the city's gods. Numbers, corpses, captives, all tallied like grain in a granary. It's grim, but also telling the same administrative mindset that invented writing and accounting was now being applied to death. Yet war in Sumer wasn't only about bloodshed, it was about legitimacy. Kings proved their divine favor through victories. A Lugal who triumphed in battle could claim the gods marched with him. Victorious rulers carved inscriptions, erected monuments, and staged parades where captured enemies were forced to march in chains. Every triumph was both political theater and religious ritual. War wasn't simply for survival. It was a performance of cosmic order. Picture a king returning from battle, his war cart rolling through the city gate, soldiers trailing behind, banners flapping. The crowd cheers, priests raise their arms in blessing, and the king dedicates the victory to his city's god. Behind the scenes, temple granaries receive wagon loads of plunder, cattle grain, captured slaves. The palace stores exotic goods stripped from defeated rivals. War was expensive, but it paid dividends if you won. Of course, not everyone celebrated. For the farmer conscripted into service, war meant abandoning fields just when they needed tending. For families, it meant sons gone, sometimes never returning. For the defeated, it meant devastation. Fields burned, canals, wrecked temples, desecrated. The line between prosperity and ruin could be as thin as the walls of a city. What's striking is how organized it all became. Sumerians pioneered the logistics of war, provisioning armies with bread and beer rations, tracking supplies on clay tablets, assigning quotas of equipment. It's one thing to win a battle. It's another to keep thousands of men fed and armed. In this, the scribes were as crucial as the spearmen. The stylus was in its own way as mighty as the spear. But if war sharpened Sumer's organization, it also strained its soul. Religious texts from this era often blend piety with violence. Gods weren't just patrons of fertility and wisdom. They were warlords. Enlil granted victory. Inanna was both goddess of love and goddess of battle. Myths described gods handing kings weapons, marching beside their armies, and delighting in the destruction of enemies. The line between divine order and military conquest blurred until they were almost indistinguishable. And yet, amid the brutality, there was also a strange sort of beauty in the record-keeping. Cylinder seals show processions of soldiers, orderly and geometric. Lyric hymns praise kings as beloved of Inanna, crusher of foreign lands. Even the instruments of death became art. The early dynastic age made one thing certain. In Sumer war wasn't an accident or an occasional disaster. It was a season as regular as the floods. Fields were plowed in spring, barley harvested in autumn, and wars fought whenever canals ran low or borders blurred. People adjusted, survived, endured. Civilization's cradle was also a crucible, and war was one of its hottest fires. It's sobering to think that while scribes were copying hymns and mathematicians calculating geometry, soldiers were marching in, step across the same land spears flashing in the sun. The first laws, the first literature, the first organized warfare, they all sprouted from the same muddy soil of Sumer. Step away from the battlefield for a moment. Beyond the clash of bronze and the boasts of kings, another current ran quietly but powerfully through Sumerian life, the lives and influence of women. The story of Sumer isn't just about soldiers and scribes. It's also about priestesses who ruled temples, workers who kept the economy humming, and one extraordinary woman whose words still echo across 4,000 years. In the daily rhythm of a Sumerian city, women were everywhere. You'd find them grinding barley into flour brewing beer in steaming vats, weaving wool into textiles. These weren't minor roles. Textiles and beer were among Sumer's greatest exports. In temple workshops, hundreds of women labored at looms, their fingers flying across threads, producing the cloth that clothed priests and kings and filled merchant ships bound for distant lands. Beer, too, was largely brewed by women. It wasn't just refreshment, it was wages, ritual offering, and daily staple. If cities ran on grain, women were the ones who transformed it into food, drink, and wealth. And while much of this labor was unrecorded, women also appear in the archives as property owners, legal actors, and business participants. Contracts survive showing women buying land, managing estates, even lending silver at interest. Marriage agreements and dowry records weren't only about controlling women, they also protected their claims, ensuring daughters and wives had recognized stakes in property. Inheritance laws often provided daughters with rights to land or goods, balancing family resources across generations. But if we look beyond the household and marketplace, women held power of an even more striking kind: religious authority. Temples weren't only staffed by male priests. In fact, some of the most important positions in Sumer were held by women. The title Entu, or High Priestess, was one of the most prestigious roles in the land. An Entu presided over rituals, managed temple estates, and commanded wealth that rivaled kings. She wasn't a mere assistant, she was the god's human counterpart, the mediator between divine and mortal. The most famous of them all was Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon of Akkad. Around 2285 BCE, she was installed as high priestess of the moon god Nana in the city of Ur. But she was more than a priestess. She was a poet. In fact, she is the first author in history whose name we know. Think about that thousands of years before Shakespeare or Homer. A Sumerian woman was writing hymns to the gods, carving her voice into clay tablets. Enheduanna's poems weren't timid offerings. They were bold lyrical, sometimes searing. In her hymns to Inanna, she describes the goddess as both nurturing and terrifying, a divine force of love and fury. She writes of exile, despair, and restoration. Her words reveal not just ritual formula, but raw, personal emotion. It's startlingly human, across 4 millennia, to hear her voice quaver with grief or blaze with triumph. In a world dominated by kings and generals, Enheduanna gave us something rarer: the inner life of a woman in power. Her position also reveals the delicate dance between temple and palace. By appointing his daughter as high priestess, Sargon fused political power with religious legitimacy. Through Enheduanna, the empire's secular and sacred realms were united. And yet she wasn't just a puppet of her father's ambition. Her hymns have survived precisely because they carried authentic insight. She used her role to shape theology, deepen devotion, and expand the spiritual imagination of her world. Beyond the lofty world of high priestesses, women participated in rituals that touched every family. Festivals often featured songs, dances, and processions led by groups of women. Household shrines, where mothers offered food to protective deities, were central to daily life. In agricultural rites, women played vital parts in ceremonies meant to ensure fertility of both womb and field. Civilization, for all its palaces and scribes, still leaned on the timeless rhythms of women tending, birthing, nurturing, and sustaining. That said, Sumerian society was not egalitarian. Patriarchy hardened over time, especially as palaces grew stronger. Legal codes show clear distinctions between men's and women's rights, with harsher penalties often falling on women in matters of adultery or inheritance. Marriage was typically arranged, dowries negotiated by families. Yet within these structures, women exercised agency, choosing how to manage their resources. weaving alliances through marriage, and in some cases, shaping public life through religious authority. The image of women in art reflects this complexity. Cylinder seals show them at banquets, drinking beer through long straws, seated alongside men. Other images place them in weaving workshops surrounded by looms. Some depict priestesses standing before altars, hands raised in prayer. Always they are present, never erased, never absent from the civic and sacred fabric. One ritual in particular highlights their significance: the sacred marriage. Each year, the king of a city would symbolically marry the goddess Inanna, represented by a high priestess. Through hymns, processions, and ritual intimacy, this union was believed to ensure the land's fertility and prosperity. Imagine the scene: the city gathered for days of feasting, music, and offerings, while within the temple, the ruler and the priestess enacted a cosmic drama. For the people of Sumer, it wasn't just spectacle, it was survival. If the sacred marriage pleased the goddess, the fields would flourish. If not, famine might follow. In this way, women's roles weren't peripheral. They were woven into the very cycle of life and cosmic order. So when we speak of Sumerian power, we must speak of women too. From the anonymous brewer, ladling frothy beer into jars, to the Entu, priestess commanding estates, to Enheduanna, shaping theology. With her poetry, women sustained, managed, and enriched the world's first civilization. They weren't always celebrated in inscriptions carved by kings, but their fingerprints are everywhere: on the clay jars, on the textiles, on the hymns. Close your eyes and picture a courtyard in Ur. The hum of looms, the scent of bread rising from clay ovens, the sound of hymns sung in a temple chamber, words written by a woman whose name we still remember. Beneath the shadow of palaces and ziggurats, women carried the weight of daily life, and sometimes they carried entire gods on their shoulders. Stand at the city gates of Ur or Lagash, and you'll hear it before you see it: the creak of donkey carts, the jingling of copper tools, the sing-song cries of merchants haggling in accents not quite local. Sumer's cities weren't islands. They were hubs, pulsing with exchange, drawing goods and ideas from far beyond the horizon. Trade was not a side note. It was the lifeblood that connected the land between the rivers to the wider world. Let's begin with geography. Sumer had fertile soil thanks to its rivers, but it lacked many crucial resources. No timber to build roofs, no hard stone for monuments, no tin to make bronze. If the Sumerians wanted anything sturdier than mud brick or reeds, they had to go shopping, and shopping meant trade. Out of necessity, the Sumerians became consummate merchants. Imagine a caravan setting out at dawn, the air cool, the donkeys laden with jars of barley beer, bolts of woven wool, baskets of dates. The drivers carried reed tallies and cylinder seals to stamp contracts. Their destination, perhaps the mountains to the east for copper and diorite, perhaps the highlands of Anatolia for obsidian, or farther still, over deserts and along coasts to reach the glowing lapis lazuli mines of Afghanistan. Every journey was long, dusty, and dangerous, but the rewards, glittering bluestones, shining metals, fragrant woods, were worth it. One of the earliest long-distance partners was Dilmun, likely in modern Bahrain. There traders exchanged Sumerian textiles and grain for copper and pearls. To the southeast lay Megan Oman, a source of hard diorite prized for statues. Farther still was the Indus Valley, from which came ivory exotic woods and carnelian beads. These weren't mere luxuries. They were proof that Sumer's cities were connected to a network stretching thousands of miles, a prehistoric global trade web long before the Silk Road. And the merchants themselves, They were pragmatists, part adventurer, part accountant. Many worked under temple contracts, carrying goods in the name of the gods. Others operated more independently, forming merchant families whose seals became their signatures. Each seal was a tiny masterpiece, carved with images of gods, animals, or heroic scenes. Roll one over wet clay, and it left a crisp impression that said this deal is official. Imagine a trader pulling out his cylinder seal, the way a modern business person might flash a company logo. Within the cities, craftwork blossomed. Workshops buzzed with activity potters spinning their wheels, bronze smiths, hammering jewelers, stringing beads into intricate necklaces. Weaving rooms, filled with the soft rhythm of looms, produced woolen cloth so fine it became Sumer's signature export. These crafts weren't just practical, they were status symbols. The elite buried themselves with gold headdresses, inlaid lyres, and delicate drinking cups. Even in death, they advertised the reach of their trade. One of the great treasures unearthed from the royal cemetery at Ur is a harp decorated with lapis lazuli and gold, its wooden body long decayed, but its ornaments still gleaming. Each element lapis from Afghanistan, gold possibly from Anatolia shell, from the Gulf, spoke of journeys that spanned continents. To play music on such an instrument was to strum the strings of an interconnected world. And trade wasn't just about goods. It carried ideas. Along with lapis came new artistic motifs, mathematical concepts, and perhaps even myths. A merchant returning from the Indus Valley might bring home not just beads, but new ways of measuring weight. A caravan from Anatolia might inspire local artisans with unfamiliar pottery styles. Cultural cross-pollination seeped into the very clay of Sumer's cities. To manage all this complexity, Sumerians pioneered commercial practices that feel remarkably modern. They developed contracts for loans, with interest rates carefully calculated around 20% annually, for silver, 33% for grain. They invented promissory notes and standardized weights and measures, making deals possible across languages and distances. Imagine scribes in temple offices scratching records. So-and-so owes so many shekels of silver due after the next harvest. The dusty roots of banking were sprouting in the shadow of ziggurats. Of course, trade was risky. Bandits haunted desert roads. Storms could sink boats, and rival cities sometimes raided caravans to enrich their own temples. To reduce risk, merchants often pooled resources, sharing both profit and danger. Some texts even describe something like insurance, where a loan would be forgiven if a shipment was lost to disaster. Clever, isn't it? Civilization may have been young, but the headaches of business management were already ancient. Trade also reshaped the daily life of ordinary people. Imported copper meant sturdier plow blades, making farming easier. Stone from distant lands became grinding tools or carved idols. Foreign woods framed doorways or burned in hearths. What seemed exotic at first became woven into everyday existence. The reach of Sumer's merchants meant that a housewife in Ur might grind flour on a stone quarried hundreds of miles away, while her husband brewed beer in a copper pot traded from Megan. Globalization, Sumerian edition. At the same time, inequality deepened. Merchants who succeeded returned home with fortunes building large houses and sponsoring feasts. Skilled craftsmen found steady work producing goods for export. But laborers often toiled long hours, weaving or hauling goods for little more than beer rations. The prosperity of trade lifted the cities, but not everyone equally. Sound familiar? Some patterns never change. Still, there was wonder in it all. Imagine being a child in Uruk, watching a caravan arrive through the city gates. The donkeys clattered in their packs, creaking. out came stones the color of deep night woods that smelled of faraway forests, shells that gleamed like moonlight. Traders told stories of mountains that scraped the sky and seas so wide they took months to cross. To that child, Sumer must have felt like the center of the world, with the universe pouring its treasures into the city's heart. In truth, it was. For a few shining centuries, Sumer's cities stood at the crossroads of tradecraft and culture. Their goods reached distant lands, and distant lands shaped them in return. Civilization was no longer just about survival. In the marshes, it was about connection networks and horizons stretching far beyond the rivers. And though the caravans creaked with weight and the sailors sweated under the sun, what they carried most of all was possibility, the proof that even in the world's first cities, people dreamed of what lay beyond the horizon and were bold enough to go find it. Close your eyes and listen, not to the clash of armies or the bustle of merchants this time, but to the softer sound of reeds scratching clay. A scribe kneels in the courtyard of a temple, his hands dusty, his stylus sharp, his tablet damp. What he's doing looks ordinary: numbers, lists, calculations. But what's unfolding in front of him is revolutionary. Out of these clay scratches, the Sumerians were building the invisible scaffolding of civilization mathematics law and the idea of social order. Let's start with the math. If you've ever glanced at a clock and wondered why on earth we divide hours into 60 minutes or circles into 360 degrees, you can thank or blame the Sumerians. They invented the sexagesimal system, base 60. To them, 60 wasn't just a convenient number. It was divine. 60 could be divided evenly by so many smaller numbers, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, that it made calculations surprisingly efficient. Scribes used this system to measure fields, calculate rations, and keep accounts that stretched beyond what memory could manage. Imagine a surveyor standing in the blazing sun, rope in hand, pacing out the edges of a barley field. Later, back at the temple, he scratches calculations into clay, using base 60 to figure the area. This wasn't abstract theory. It meant knowing how much barley the land would yield, how much tax the farmer owed, how much beer the temple could brew. Math wasn't just numbers. It was survival disguised as geometry. The Sumerians also developed multiplication tables, problem texts, even early quadratic equations. Some tablets show students solving problems about dividing fields or calculating volumes of granaries. Picture a weary student, brow furrowed, muttering, "If a canal is so many cubits long and so many cubits wide and the water flows this fast, how many days until the fish swim out?" Ancient math homework, frustrating, then frustrating now. And alongside math came law. As cities grew, disputes multiplied: who owned a field, who owed whom, who was responsible when a wall collapsed and crushed a neighbor's goat. Oral tradition could only go so far. So Sumerians began to record legal cases on clay tablets. These weren't yet the full codes of Hammurabi, but they were the roots. Judges weighed evidence, scribes recorded rulings, and precedents formed. Property contracts survive that read almost eerily familiar. So-and-so sells this field to so-and-so for so many shekels of silver. There are marriage contracts specifying dowries, divorce conditions, even inheritance rights. Adoption records show families formally welcoming children with all the obligations spelled out. Law, in other words, wasn't arbitrary. It was written, standardized, and available for reference. That gave people a sense of stability. Justice wasn't just the whim of a powerful neighbor. It was something you could appeal to, something you could point to in clay. Of course, fairness had limits. The law codes reflected the hierarchies of the city. Penalties varied depending on whether you were elite commoner or slave. A wealthy merchant might pay a fine for an offense that would see a laborer flogged. Still, the very existence of formal law was a breakthrough. It meant disputes could be resolved without perpetual cycles of revenge. It was civilization saying, let's write down the rules so we don't have to keep hitting each other with sticks every time. Law also seeped into daily life through rituals and oaths. Imagine two men standing before a temple statue, swearing to uphold a contract. The scribe records it, the gods witness it, and breaking it isn't just a legal violation, it's sacrilege. In this way, law and religion fused together. Justice wasn't just practical, it was cosmic. To cheat your neighbor was to offend Enlil himself. And then there were the courts. Judges sat in open courtyards, listening to testimony, consulting tablets of precedent. Witnesses swore oaths, sometimes touching sacred objects to prove sincerity. The whole process was slower, more deliberate than simply letting neighbors settle things with fists. Civilization was learning patience, even if grudgingly. Together, math and law shaped the invisible architecture of Sumerian cities. Temples could calculate how much grain to store. Palaces could levy taxes with precision. Merchants could borrow and lend with predictable interest. Farmers knew their land boundaries were protected by written contracts. The city wasn't held together only by walls or canals, it was bound by numbers and rules etched into clay. This infrastructure created something remarkable, the ability to plan for the future. When you can measure harvests, levy taxes, and enforce contracts, you can dream bigger. You can build temples that take decades to complete or launch irrigation projects spanning miles. You can risk sending caravans across deserts knowing contracts and seals will hold up. Without numbers and rules, cities crumble. With them, they thrive. But let's not pretend it was all orderly perfection. Records show plenty of disputes, fraud, and grumbling. A farmer might try to fudge the boundaries of his field. A merchant might overcharge for copper. A debtor might swear the flood destroyed his barley, when really he'd drunk the proceeds in beer. The law courts existed because people misbehaved. Civilization has never meant angelic behavior, just organized attempts to keep the chaos manageable. And in their quieter moments, the Sumerians themselves reflected on these systems. Some of their wisdom texts sound like advice your grandmother might give: do not buy an ass that brays too loudly. Others were sterner: he who neglects the words of the judge, Enlil will curse. Behind the humor and severity lies the recognition that rules, numbers, and justice were fragile threads holding society together. So picture the city at dusk. Priests chant in the temple, merchants haggle in the market, and in a side chamber, a young scribe copies multiplication tables, while his master watches with a reed rod in hand. Across the street, a judge listens to a dispute about a collapsed wall while clay tablets pile up at his feet. All of it, math, law, order, woven together into the fabric of urban life. It may not be as dramatic as war, or as dazzling as ziggurats, but without these quiet revolutions, civilization could never have lasted. The Sumerians were learning to think, not just in terms of today's harvest, but tomorrow's rules. And in that, they built something just as enduring as their temples: the idea that society rests not only on strength, but on structure, on numbers that add up, and laws that hold firm. By the middle of the 3rd millennium, BCE, Sumer had grown restless. Dozens of city-states crowded the southern plain, each with its own god, its own king, its own pride. For centuries they had squabbled, signed treaties, broken them, and marched against one another over canals and boundary stones. But then came a ruler, bold enough to think bigger. His name was Lugalzagesi, and he dreamed of ruling not just one city, but all of Sumer. Lugalzagesi began in the city of Umma, a perennial rival of Lagash. Umma had long chafed at its neighbor's control of disputed fields. The canals between them had seen as much blood as water. Into this cauldron stepped Lugal-Zaghazi, ambitious, determined, and perhaps a little reckless. He wasn't content to defend Umma's borders. He wanted to erase them and replace them with his own. One by one, he struck at rival cities. Lagash fell, its monuments smashed, its temples looted. In inscriptions, Lugal-Zaghazi boasted of burning sanctuaries and scattering enemies like broken pottery. He wasn't shy about his brutality. It was part of his claim to greatness. For him, conquest wasn't a shameful necessity. It was the proof that the gods favored him. And indeed, he claimed divine backing. In his proclamations, he declared that Enlil, the storm god, had given him kingship over all the lands between the upper and lower seas, an early Sumerian version of manifest destiny. The language is striking, no longer just king of Umma or king of Lagash, but king of the land. Lugal-Zaghazi wanted to transcend the patchwork of city-states and create something larger, an empire. Imagine the scene as his armies marched. Lines of spearmen in leather cloaks, bronze-headed axes glinting. War carts rattling on solid wheels pulled by onagers snorting in the dust. Priests carrying standards marked with the emblems of Umma's gods, invoking divine terror on the enemy. Behind them, scribes with clay tablets ready to record the spoils, grain, cattle, captives. It wasn't just conquest, it was inventory. And city after city fell. Uruk, that ancient jewel of Sumer, came under his sway. So did Urkish and others. At his peak, Lugal-Zaghazi claimed dominion over the entire southern plain. In his inscriptions, he goes further still, boasting that his rule stretched from the lower sea to the upper sea, from the Persian Gulf, all the way to the Mediterranean. Was that true? Almost certainly not. But as every ambitious ruler knows, exaggeration is half the game. If people believed it, the illusion of empire was almost as good as the reality. For a moment, it must have seemed he had done it. The centuries of squabbling city-states were over. Sumer, fractured for so long, appeared united under one crown. The temples hummed with offerings to Enlil's scribes, scratched his name into clay, and envoys from neighboring lands bowed at his court. To the weary farmers who had known only war, perhaps it even felt like relief one overlord was better than a dozen bickering kings. And yet, beneath the triumph, cracks showed. His empire was fragile, stitched together by force rather than loyalty. Cities submitted because they feared him, not because they loved him. And fear is a brittle mortar. All it takes is one harder blow, one rival stronger still, and the empire collapses. That blow was already on its way from the north. But let's linger a moment on what Lugal-Zaghazi accomplished, however briefly. He was the first Sumerian ruler to articulate the dream of unity. He imagined Sumer not as a cluster of jealous city-states, but as a single realm, under one ruler, one God's chosen. His inscriptions, grandiose though they are, mark a shift in political imagination. It was no longer enough to be king of Uruk or Ur. The new ambition was to be king of Sumer. It's easy drifting off in our beds now to dismiss him as just another warlord boasting in clay. But think about it, without men like Lugal-Zaghazi, the idea of empire might never have taken root. He failed, yes, but failure has a way of planting seeds. His brief unification showed what was possible, and it set the stage for someone else, someone far more cunning and ruthless, to take the dream further. Because even as Lugal-Zaghazi carved his boasts into stone, a man named Sargon was watching. A man from the north of humble beginnings who would learn from Lugal-Zaghazi's ambition and surpass it. If Lugal-Zaghazi was the spark, Sargon would be the flame. For now, though, picture the king of Umma standing atop the walls of Uruk, the wind whipping his cloak, the horizon stretching wide. He believes the world is his, that Enlil himself has placed the land into his hands. His soldiers cheer his scribes, record his enemies' bow. For one shining moment, he has made the dream of empire real. And like so many dreamers of empire after him, he cannot see how quickly it will slip away. History loves a good twist. Just as Lugal-Zaggisi stood triumphant, his name carved into monuments, his rivals scattered. His rule proclaimed as divinely sanctioned, the ground shifted beneath him. From the north, a man of humbler origins rose one who would eclipse Lugal-Zaggisi and reshape Mesopotamia forever. His name was Sargon of Akkad. Now, if Lugal-Zaggisi was the archetype of the swaggering conqueror, Sargon was the storybook upstart. Legend says he began as a cupbearer to the king of Kish, a servant who poured wine at royal banquets. But Sargon's story stretches even further into myth. Later tradition claimed he was the secret child of a priestess, set adrift in a reed basket on the Euphrates, and found by a gardener, echoes of Moses long before the Bible. Whether true or embroidered, the story mattered less than the message Sargon rose from nothing, chosen by the gods, destined to rule. And rise he did. Around 2334 BCE, he overthrew his master and seized Kish. From there, he marched south, clashing with none other than Lugal-Zaggisi. In inscriptions, Sargon boasts of capturing him and parading him in chains to Nippur, the holy city. Imagine the spectacle. The conqueror humbled the would-be unifier, dragged like a trophy before the gods. If Lugal-Zaggisi dreamed of Empire, Sargon turned it into reality by crushing him first. With Uruk and Ur under his control, Sargon proclaimed himself king of Akkad, and then went further king of Sumer and Akkad. It was the first time a ruler explicitly claimed dominion over both North and South Mesopotamia, fusing the Semitic-speaking Akkadians of the north with the Sumerians of the south. The patchwork of city-states was becoming something new, an empire. Let's pause and imagine the Akkadian army at its height. Soldiers marched in ranks, bronze helmets, gleaming spears bristling. Behind them rumbled war carts, their solid wheels throwing dust into the air. Standards of gods flapped overhead, Inanna's lion Enlil's horned crown. Sargon's armies didn't just raid, they conquered, occupied, and held. From the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean cities trembled at his approach. And Sargon knew the value of image. His inscriptions tell us he washed his weapons in the sea after victory, a ritual to show that his conquests reached the world's edge. He established a new capital, Akkad, though frustratingly, its ruins remain lost to us, buried somewhere under millennia of soil. Akkad was more than a city. It was a symbol, a new center of power that rivaled ancient Uruk. From its palaces, Sargon sent governors, tax collectors, and soldiers to every corner of his empire. Administration was the true genius of Sargon's reign. Conquest is flashy, but empires live or die on bureaucracy. Sargon appointed loyal officials to govern conquered cities, stationed Akkadian garrisons to enforce order, and demanded tribute that poured back to Akkad in silver, grain, and labor. Yet he didn't erase Sumerian culture. Instead, he fused it with Akkadian. Sumerian remained the language of scholarship and religion, while Akkadian became the language of administration and everyday life. It was a cultural marriage, sometimes uneasy but enduring. And the god Sargon was careful to bring them on board. He claimed Inanna, or Ishtar, as she was increasingly called in Akkadian, had granted him kingship. Festivals celebrated his victories as divine favor. Temples rose not just in Sumer, but in newly conquered lands. Religion became empire's glue, uniting distant peoples under shared rituals and divine narratives. Of course, not everyone celebrated. Revolts flared constantly. Cities resent tribute. Local rulers chafed under Akkadian governors. But Sargon proved relentless. One inscription says he fought 34 battles in a single year. Another claims he subdued 55 cities. Even if we discount exaggeration, the scale is staggering. His enemies called him ruthless. His followers called him chosen. Both were probably right. And yet in quieter corners, Sargon's empire brought prosperity. Trade expanded even further, stretching roots to Anatolia, Elam, and the Levant. Akkadian merchants carried Sumerian textiles, Akkadian soldiers secured roads, and Akkadian scribes recorded the flow of goods. Farmers continued to plow brewers, continued to brew weavers, continued to weave, but now their products traveled farther. Their taxes heavier, their lives tied to a king who might never set foot in their city. Think for a moment of the ordinary man in Ur during Sargon's reign. He wakes to tend his barley, but part of his harvest now goes north to Akkad. He sees Akkadian soldiers patrolling the streets, speaking a language not quite his own. He prays in the temple of Nana, but the offerings are now inscribed with Sargon's name. His life is both the same and profoundly changed. Such is empire, it reshapes the horizon while leaving the daily grind intact. And Sargon himself, he reigned for decades longer than most conquerors manage. He grew old in power, his image carved into monuments, his name whispered in fear and awe. He was in many ways the prototype of the great conqueror. Humble origins, relentless ambition, cunning strategy, ruthless execution. Centuries later, kings in Mesopotamia would still style themselves like Sargon. His shadow loomed over them all. But empires like men age. Toward the end of his reign, rebellions multiplied. The more territory he claimed, the harder it was to hold. His successors inherited both his glory and his burdens. The dream of empire had been realized, but maintaining it would prove harder than conquering it. Still, as you drift off now, imagine the scene: Sargon standing on a high wall in Akkad, gazing west toward the Mediterranean east, toward the mountains south toward the Gulf. The wind whips his cloak, the sun glints off his bronze helmet. Below him, his soldiers drill his scribes, tally his governors, send reports. For the first time in history, one man rules this vast stretch of land. For the first time, an empire truly exists. And though Akkad itself is lost to us, buried and silent, Sargon's legend endures, whispered in clay, sung in hymns, remembered as the man who turned a dream into power. Empires often shine brightest just before they begin to crack. After Sargon's long reign, the Akkadian Empire stood tall, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, a patchwork of cities, languages, and gods, all bound sometimes uneasily under one crown. His sons and grandsons inherited this vast machine. Some faltered, some endured, and one in particular left a mark so deep that his name still sends a shiver down clay tablets: Naram-Sin, Sargon's grandson, the king of the four quarters. But before we reach him, let's linger on what Sargon's successors inherited. The empire was immense, its tribute flowing like rivers of silver grain and labor. Akkadian garrisons watched over cities once fiercely independent. Governors carried orders sealed with the king's emblem. Temples across Sumer now inscribed offerings not just to Enlil or Inanna, but in the name of Akkadian rulers. Yet beneath this glittering order, tensions pulsed. Conquered cities remembered their freedom. Local rulers seethed at tribute demands. Each harvest brought not only barley, but the possibility of revolt. Raimush and Manishtushu, Sargon's immediate successors, spent much of their reigns putting out fires quite literally. Revolts flared, enemies regrouped, but the Akkadian war machine ground on. Clay inscriptions tell us they fought relentlessly, crushing rebellions and reasserting control. Their victories kept the empire alive, but their reigns were overshadowed by the looming memory of Sargon, the great founder. They were caretakers of a giant too heavy to manage until Naram-Sin arrived. Now, if Sargon was remembered as the first conqueror, Naram-Sin was remembered as the first to go one step further. He dared to call himself a god. Bold, isn't it? But that's the kind of king he was. Imagine his armies marching out their banners, flying their ranks disciplined. Naram-Sin didn't just defend the empire, he expanded it. He pushed into the Zagros Mountains, subdued the Lullaby tribes, and extended Akkadian influence deeper than before. The famous victory stele of Naram-Sin shows him climbing a mountain helmet crowned with horns, the divine symbol usually reserved for gods. His soldiers march below him, orderly and strong, while defeated enemies beg for mercy. The imagery is clear. Naram-Sin is no mere man. He is semi-divine, chosen by the heavens to rule the earth. It was a radical move. Mesopotamian kings had always claimed divine favor, but they stopped short of claiming divinity itself. Naram-Sin erased that line. For some, it must have been awe-inspiring. For others, scandalous. But for Naram-Sin, it was propaganda gold. To declare himself God-King was to make rebellion not just treason, but blasphemy. Under his rule, the empire thrived in ways both brutal and brilliant. Trade routes flourished, drawing in timber metals and lapis. Akkadian became the lingua franca across Mesopotamia, written in cuneiform that blended Sumerian tradition with Semitic innovation. Cities grew, temples gleamed, and for a while it must have felt as though Akkad was unshakable. But no empire is unshakable. Even as Naram-Sin boasted of conquest, shadows gathered. A long drought gripped the region, rivers shrinking, crops failing. Archaeological layers from this era show dust and dryness where once there had been fertile floodplains. Hungry cities are restless cities. Add to this invasions from the Zagros highlands, the Gudians, fierce tribes who raided and harassed Akkadian holdings. To later Sumerians, the Gudians were bogeymen blamed for every collapse, described as barbarians who knew not the gods nor how to properly till the fields. In reality, they were opportunists pressing into the cracks of a faltering empire. Revolts flared again. Cities rose against Akkadian governors. Tribute dried up. Grain shortages spread. The once mighty empire wobbled. Even the god-king couldn't hold back drought, hunger, and resentment forever. After Naram-Sin's death, his successors struggled. The administrative machine creaked under its own weight. One by one, cities slipped away until finally Akkad itself was left exposed. By around 2150 BCE, the empire collapsed. The Gudians swept through, dismantling what remained. Akkad, the glorious capital, vanished so thoroughly that we still haven't found it. Archaeologists can't point to its ruins on a map. It's a ghost city remembered in inscriptions, but lost beneath the soil. A sobering fate for the world's first empire. And yet the Akkadian legacy endured. Their innovations didn't vanish with their walls. The fusion of Sumerian and Akkadian cultures lived on. Sumerian remained the sacred tongue of scholarship and liturgy for centuries, even as Akkadian became the language of diplomacy and daily life. The concept of empire itself, the idea that one king could rule vast, diverse lands, was now etched into Mesopotamia's imagination. Kings, after Naram-Sin, would dream the same dream style themselves after him, and carve their own boasts in clay and stone. Perhaps the most haunting legacy is cultural memory. Later Sumerian scribes looked back on the Akkadian period with both awe and bitterness. They wrote laments describing how arrogant kings offended the gods and brought ruin on themselves. They turned Naram-Sin into a cautionary tale, the king who called himself a god and was punished with famine and invasion. Was it propaganda moralizing or truth? Maybe all three. What matters is that Akkad became a lesson. Greatness is fragile hubris, dangerous empires mortal. And so, as you drift in thought, picture the victory stele once more. Naram Sin climbs the mountain-horned helmet, gleaming soldiers at his back, enemies beneath his feet. He is radiant, triumphant, almost divine. And yet, from the perspective of centuries, we know what he could not, that drought would crack the fields, that Gutians would swarm the plains, that Akkad's bricks would crumble into silence. Still, in that moment, he stood as the pinnacle of ancient ambition, the first king bold enough to crown himself God, the inheritor of Sargon's dream, the man who carried empire to its glittering height. His footsteps echo, still not in the ruins of a lost capital, but in the very idea of empire that shaped history ever after. Empires fall, but cities endure. When the Akkadian Empire crumbled under drought rebellion and Gutian raids, it seemed as though the dream of unity had dissolved back into dust. Yet in southern Mesopotamia, amid the ruins of old glories, a familiar name began to rise once more, Ur. From this ancient city, kings would stage one of history's great comebacks, the third dynasty of Ur, around 2100 BCE. To later scribes, this era was a golden age. They spoke of kings wise and just canals flowing, ziggurats, gleaming scribes busily recording every last bushel of grain. The chaos of the Gutians faded into memory as Ur's rulers restored order, wealth, and culture. For a few shining decades, Sumer enjoyed something that looked suspiciously like empire again, but this time with a distinctly Sumerian stamp. The dynasty began with Ur-Nammu, a ruler of remarkable vision. He seized power in Ur and quickly extended his control over neighboring cities. His genius wasn't just military, it was organizational. Ur-Nammu understood that a kingdom held together by spears alone would collapse as surely as Akkad had. So he set about building something deeper, law infrastructure and faith. One of his first projects was monumental, the ziggurat of Ur, a towering temple platform dedicated to the moon god Nana. Imagine it massive terraces rising in steps faced with baked brick that gleamed in the sun stairways climbing skyward. To the people of Ur, it was more than architecture. It was a mountain built by human hands, a bridge between earth and heaven. Pilgrims must have gazed at it in awe the way later generations looked at cathedrals or skyscrapers. And in truth, it was both a feat of engineering and a statement of faith. But Ur-Nammu's most enduring legacy wasn't brick. It was law. He issued one of the world's first comprehensive law codes centuries before Hammurabi. Written in Sumerian, it laid out rules for property, marriage, inheritance, and punishment. The penalties were often fines rather than brutal retribution, suggesting a concern for balance rather than spectacle. If a man divorces a wife, the code might say he shall pay so many shekels of silver. Justice was being formalized, predictable, and at least on clay impartial. For a farmer or merchant, that meant disputes didn't have to spiral into blood feuds. They could be settled with tablets and silver instead of spears. Civilization, in its quiet way, was learning fairness. Ur-Nammu's reign ended violently. He fell in battle, but his vision carried on through his son Shulgi. If Ur-Nammu built the foundations, Shulgi decorated the house. His reign stretched nearly half a century, a remarkable span for the ancient world. Under Shulgi, the Ur-3 state became a true bureaucratic empire. He standardized weights and measures, expanded scribal schools, and kept armies moving swiftly along maintained roads. He even bragged of running 100 miles in a single day to inspect his kingdom. Whether that's true or the world's first royal exaggeration, we'll never know. Bureaucracy, under Shulgi, reached dazzling heights and dizzying paperwork. Clay tablets from this era number in the tens of thousands, detailing everything from grain rations for workers to the number of sheep sacrificed in temples. We can read, for instance, that a brewer received so many jars of barley, or that a worker's family was allotted a certain quantity of fish. The system was almost modern in its precision. If you ever feel bogged down by office spreadsheets, imagine doing it in cuneiform, on clay, under the Mesopotamian sun. The clerks of Ur were history's first paper pushers, though their paper weighed a lot more. Religion remained the state's bedrock. Kings of Ur styled themselves not just as rulers, but as stewards of the god's order. Festivals flourished, hymns were composed, temples rebuilt. The king was often portrayed as shepherd of his people, chosen by the gods to guide and protect. The metaphor mattered in a land of herds and flocks. The idea of kingship as shepherding carried both authority and responsibility. But empire is always fragile. Even as glittered problems simmered, the bureaucracy, so meticulous, was also cumbersome. Peasant farmers, burdened by taxes, grumbled. Droughts returned, straining irrigation. Nomadic groups pressed against the borders, raiding and testing the king's reach. Shulgi's successors struggled to hold it all together. For all the records, all the laws, all the ziggurats, Ur's empire was in the end mortal. By 2004 BCE, the Elamites from the east stormed Ur. The city was sacked. Its walls breached, its temples looted. The lamentations that followed are among the most haunting texts in history. Scribes wrote poetic dirges mourning the fall of the city. Ur is destroyed. Bitter is its lamentation. Imagine citizens watching flames consume the ziggurat smoke, rising like a dark parody of incense. For a people who believed their cities were protected by gods, the destruction was shattering. And yet, even in ruin, Ur's third dynasty left an enduring imprint. Its law codes influenced those that came after. Its bureaucracy gave later empires a model, both a blueprint and a warning. Its hymns, many composed during Shulgi's reign, preserved the spiritual imagination of Sumer in lines that would echo through Babylonian and Assyrian prayers. And the ziggurat of Ur, though battered, survived in fragments to awe archaeologists thousands of years later. So, as you drift tonight, picture the moon rising over the Euphrates. Its light glints on the baked bricks of a ziggurat stairways climbing to the heavens. In the courtyards below, scribes tally rations, priests sing hymns, and families share bread. For a moment, order has returned. Chaos has been beaten back. The shepherds of Ur have built a world that feels secure, structured, divine. It won't last, of course. Nothing does. But for a generation under Ur-Nammu and Shulgi, the dream of civilization burned bright again. And that light, brief though it was, still flickers across the ages. If clay tablets could sing, the Sumerians would have left us a library of voices echoing across the ages. They did not just tally sheep or calculate grain. They gave us poetry, myth hymns, and laments, the world's first literature. And in those wedge-shaped lines pressed into clay, we hear not only the rhythms of daily life, but the heartbeat of the human soul. The Sumerians had been writing for centuries, but during the late 3rd millennium, BCE, especially under the kings of Ur III, literature blossomed into something remarkable. Schools of scribes weren't content to practice multiplication tables anymore. They copied hymns, proverbs, and long poetic narratives. The world's first canon of texts began to take shape, curated by scholars who saw themselves not just as accountants, but as guardians of culture. Let's start with the hymns. Imagine a temple courtyard at dawn. Priests and priestesses chant as incense curls upward, their voices lifted in devotion to Inanna Enlil or Nana. Many of those hymns were written down, and some were the work of that extraordinary high priestess we met earlier in Hedouana. Her hymns to Inanna described the goddess as fierce and radiant, a bringer of war and love, a force both terrifying and beautiful. In one, Hedouana pours out personal anguish over exile only to be restored by divine favor. It is raw, emotional, startlingly intimate. This isn't just ritual, it's poetry that could have been written yesterday by someone struggling with loss and longing. Then there are the myths. Creation stories told how gods shaped the world from chaos, how humans were molded from clay to serve divine needs. Flood narratives described catastrophic deluges sent by angry gods, survived only by a chosen hero who builds a boat, echoes that would ripple into the Hebrew Bible and beyond. Tales of Inanna's descent into the underworld speak of death rebirth and the terrifying silence of the grave. These weren't bedtime stories. They were attempts to wrestle with the deepest mysteries of existence. And of course, there was the great epic Gilgamesh, which we've already glimpsed. By the Ur-the-Thri period, scribes began stitching together earlier tales of Gilgamesh into a coherent narrative. The king of Uruk, larger than life, grieving for his lost friend Enkidu, searching desperately for immortality. His journey became the world's first true epic poem, a mirror in which generations could see their fears and hopes reflected. That the story survived in countless copies long after Sumerian itself ceased to be spoken is proof of its power. But not all Sumerian literature was lofty. Some of it was wonderfully practical or even humorous. Collections of proverbs survive, scratched into clay by students practicing their stylus strokes. Some are moral. The strong man guards the weak one. Others are practical. Don't buy an ass that brays too loudly. And some, frankly, are hilarious. A scribe without a teacher is like a blind man in the street. It seems even 4,000 years ago, students were grumbling about homework. There were also debates, little allegorical poems, where two things, say summer and winter, or grain and sheep, argued their superiority before the gods. The format is almost playful. One side brags, the other mocks, until a deity delivers the verdict. They read like ancient debate club transcripts, but under the humor lies something profound, the attempt to understand balance in the world, to weigh opposites, to define value. And then the laments. Few texts are more haunting than the laments composed after the fall of cities. When Ur itself fell in 2004, BCE scribes poured grief into clay. The city weeps, its people groan. Its gods have left it, its walls lie in ruin. These weren't dry chronicles. They were catharsis, communal mourning, theology and poetry all at once. Reading them today, you can almost hear the wails echoing down ruined streets, the sound of a people trying to make sense of catastrophe. What's astonishing is how much of this literature survived not just for their contemporaries, but for us. Archaeologists have unearthed thousands of tablets, many copied by students long after the original works were composed. Sumerian eventually ceased to be a spoken language, replaced by Akkadian, but it lived on as a language of scholarship like Latin in medieval Europe. Generations of scribes memorized, copied, and preserved the old stories, ensuring they outlasted their cities. And through these texts, we glimpse the Sumerians' inner world. They weren't just farmers or warriors or scribes. They were thinkers, poets, mourners, dreamers. They asked the same questions we do. Why do we suffer? Why do we die? What is justice? What is love? They laughed at silly proverbs, wept at laments, and pondered cosmic mysteries. Civilization wasn't only about canals and taxes. It was about finding meaning in a world that could feel terrifyingly fragile. Think of it this way. The the Sumerians gave us not just bricks and bureaucracy, but literature, the ability to capture human thought in words that could leap across centuries. Without them, we might never have had Homer's epics, the Psalms, Shakespeare's sonnets, or the novels on your bookshelf. Every story we tell is in a sense an echo of that first clay tablet pressed in Uruk or Ur. So as you drift tonight, imagine a dim scribal school. Students kneel on reed mats tablets in their laps, copying hymns by lamplight. Outside, the city hums with life, but inside, something timeless is happening. A boy scratches a proverb, a teacher corrects his strokes, a hymn is copied once more. In those quiet acts, the Sumerians were giving us a gift, the gift of literature, the gift of memory, the gift of voice. And those voices are still here. Soft, faint, but insistent. They remind us that 4,000 years ago, humans were already writing down their fears and hopes, already laughing, already grieving, already telling stories. In clay, they found a way to make themselves immortal. All golden ages fade. For Sumer, the third dynasty of Ur, was a final blaze of brilliance before the shadows crept in. The ziggurat of Ur still gleamed in the moonlight. Scribes still filled tablets with hymns and contracts. Kings still proclaimed themselves shepherds of their people. But under the surface, cracks spread through the foundations. The land that had nurtured the world's first civilization was beginning to betray it. The culprit was subtle at first, the soil itself. For centuries, Sumerians had irrigated their fields, diverting river water into canals. The practice made the desert bloom, but it carried a hidden cost. Each time water evaporated under the fierce Mesopotamian sun, it left behind salt. Slowly, the fields turned white with salinization. Yields fell. Barley, more salt-tolerant than wheat, became the main crop. But even barley began to struggle. The land that had once given abundance now gave less with each generation. As harvests shrank, tensions grew. The bureaucracy of Ur pressed harder, demanding tribute and taxes to keep canals flowing, temples supplied, and armies fed. For peasants, life grew harsher. Complaints echo in the tablets: rations too small, debts too heavy, harvests too lean. Civilization's strength had always been its organization, but now that organization felt like a burden. And outside the walls, new pressures mounted. Nomadic Amorite tribes pressed in from the west, drawn by Sumer's wealth and weakened defenses. From the east came the Elamites' mountain dwellers with ambitions of their own. The Gutians had faded into memory, but the pattern remained: when a great city weakens, neighbors pounce. The kings of Ur fought to hold the line. They built walls, maintained garrisons, and performed elaborate rituals to assure the gods' favor. Yet each year seemed harder than the last. Grain shortages sparked unrest. Revolts simmered in provinces. The empire, that once prided itself on order, strained under the weight of hunger, invasion, and resentment. The end came suddenly. In 2004 BCE, the Elamites swept down from the east and sacked Ur. Imagine the terror as their armies breached the walls. Flames consuming houses, smoke rising like a black banner. The great ziggurat, once a stairway to heaven, was desecrated. Temples were plundered, treasures hauled away, people carried into captivity. The proud shepherd king of Ur was led off in chains. To the Sumerians, this wasn't just political defeat, it was cosmic catastrophe. If the gods had protected Ur for centuries, why had they now abandoned it? The scribes answered with laments. The lamentation for Ur is one of the most haunting texts in human history. The storm took away the city. Its people groan, its walls lie in ruin. Nana, lord of Ur, has left his temple. The city weeps bitterly, Imagine the voices of survivors chanting these lines in the ruins, the air heavy with smoke and grief. For them, the destruction wasn't only about kings and armies. It was about the collapse of order itself, the unraveling of the cosmic fabric that had held society together. And yet the laments reveal something more than despair. They preserved memory. By turning catastrophe into poetry, the Sumerians ensured their suffering would not vanish. Even in ruin, they clung to words as a lifeline. Their cities might burn, but their voices would endure on clay. After Ur's fall, no Sumerian city ever regained true independence. Amorite dynasties rose in Babylon. Elamite power waxed and waned, and new cultures pressed in. The Sumerians didn't vanish overnight. They continued to live in their cities, till their fields, and worship their gods. But their distinct identity dissolved into the larger currents of Mesopotamian life. Their language, once the voice of kings, became a scholarly tongue, preserved by priests and scribes long after ordinary people spoke Akkadian. Like Latin in medieval Europe, Sumerian lingered as the language of learning long after it died in the streets. It is easy from our vantage point to see this as inevitable. Civilizations rise, civilizations fall. But for the people of Ur, it must have felt like the end of the world. The ziggurat blackened the canals, choked the gods silent. Families scattered, temples desecrated. Imagine a child clutching a clay figurine while fleeing the burning city, the night sky lit red behind them. That moment of loss, multiplied thousands of times, was what the fall of Sumer meant. And yet, endings can also be beginnings. The Amorites, who moved into Mesopotamia, adopted Sumerian gods' myths and laws. Babylonian scribes copied Sumerian hymns, preserving Gilgamesh-Inanna's descent and the laments for Ur. The Elamites, too, absorbed Sumerian ideas of kingship and order. In a sense, Sumer's death was also its diffusion. Its culture did not vanish. It spread, transformed, and seeded the civilizations to come. Still, the laments linger. They are the world's first elegies for fallen cities, predecessors of every dirge sung for Troy, Carthage, or Jerusalem. They remind us that behind every collapse are human lives, farmers and craftsmen, mothers and children who felt the world cracking beneath them. So as you drift tonight, picture the ruins of Ur in the moonlight. The ziggurat stands shattered, its bricks scattered like bones. The air is quiet save for the low sob of survivors chanting laments. And yet in that quiet, a kind of immortality takes root. The city may be gone, but the words remain. And through those words, we still walk, its streets, still hear its weeping, still remember. Civilizations crumble, cities fall, languages fade, gods are forgotten. But sometimes, even after the bricks are scattered and the temples silent, something lingers. For Sumer, that something was more than ruins in the soil. It was a legacy that refused to die. Think of it this way: when you glance at your watch and see the time, when you look at a circle and know it holds 360 degrees, when you write words on a page, whether in pen or pixel, you are brushing against Sumer. The people of the marshes who pressed reeds into clay 5,000 years ago still live quietly in our habits. They are in their way immortal. Take writing. The Sumerians didn't invent it to compose poetry or philosophy. They just wanted to keep their grain account straight. Yet their clay tablets blossomed into the first literature, the first law codes, the first histories. Without them, Gilgamesh would have remained only a fireside tale lost in the wind. Instead, he became humanity's first epic hero. That leap from oral to written, from fleeting breath to permanent mark, was Sumer's greatest gift. Every book, every email, every story whispered to the future traces back to those first wedge-shaped signs. Or take law. Ur-Nammu's code, etched in Sumerian, spelled out rules of property, marriage, and justice. Later, Hammurabi of Babylon would expand on it, carving his code into stone. But the impulse was already there to make order visible, to write fairness into clay, so it couldn't be forgotten. The idea that law is more than custom, that it can be codified and enforced, was a Sumerian seed. And then numbers and time. Their base 60 system gave us the minutes ticking by. As you listen to this, 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. We still live inside their mathematical imagination, though most of us don't even realize it. It is a quiet inheritance woven into our very sense of time and space. Their myths, too, outlived them. The flood story of Utnapishtim became Noah's Ark. Inanna's descent into the underworld echoes in Persephone's tale in Greece. Gilgamesh's quest for immortality set the template for every hero's journey to come. The Sumerian gods may no longer receive offerings, but their stories never really died. They migrated, transformed, and found new homes in later cultures. Even their failures became lessons. Later, Mesopotamians remembered Naram-Sin, not only as a conqueror, but as a warning the king who dared to call himself a god and brought disaster. They remembered the salinized fields and the fall of Ur as cautionary tales about hubris and the fragility of order. Sumer taught its heirs not just how to build, but how to mourn, how to reflect, how to remember. When archaeologists began digging in Mesopotamia in the 19th century, Sumer rose again. Clay tablets long buried in the dust whispered their stories anew. Imagine the awe of the first scholar sounding out those wedge-shaped marks, realizing he was hearing a voice from 4,000 years ago. Suddenly, the cradle of civilization wasn't just legend, it was tangible, speaking in its own words. And what of the people themselves? They didn't think of themselves as immortal. Their laments tell us they feared oblivion, that they mourned ruined cities and absent gods. They saw life as fragile, fleeting, subject to floods and storms. Yet by writing it all down, by pressing their grief and their joy into clay, they achieved what Gilgamesh longed for. Not eternal life in the flesh, but eternal life in memory. Picture this: the marshes of southern Mesopotamia, the reeds whispering in the night wind. Somewhere out there, a farmer still bent over his barley, a scribe still hunched with his stylus, a priestess still raising her hands to the moon. They are gone. Their cities buried their gods, silent, but their voices captured in clay, echoed in time, still reach us. So what is the immortality of Sumer? It is the story of humanity's first great leap into complexity. The first city walls, the first bureaucracies, the first written words, the first epics, the first laws. It is the reminder that even in the mud and uncertainty of life, humans are capable of building beauty, order, and meaning. As you rest tonight, let that thought linger. The Sumerians walked this earth 5,000 years ago, yet they are still with us. In the tick of the clock, in the pages of a book, in the structure of a contract, in the rhythm of a story told at night. They sought permanence, and in their way, they found it. Civilizations fall, but memory endures. And through memory, Sumer lives immortal, not in bricks or temples, but in us.